reacting to the recent wide receiver and quarterback moves around the NFL. That's what we're going to do on today's RotoViz Overtime. There's been a lot of movement over the last kind of 4 or 5 days. We are at the start of the kind of tampering period. We'll be going to free agency. So there's lots more that we'll have to react to in the coming weeks. But to be honest, I'm quite surprised over the weekend as to how much happened. I was telling Shawn before we started recording today, I recorded a show with Kevin Safranik last week. And by the time I had it posted, I was thinking, like, how have all these things happening as we're just posting this show that we just talked about? I thought it was going to be like a nice, relatively quiet weekend, but we had a lot of moves. And just before we started recording, the news breaking that Chris Godwin is going to stick with the Buccaneers on a 3-year contract for him. So we'll be talking through that, Geno Smith, DK Metcalf, things like that on today's show. Shawn, it's been a week since we had a chance to talk. How are you here as we approach what could be feels like could be a pretty wild time? There's going to be a lot of teams looking for quarterbacks, whether free agency and through the draft, and we're going to see a lot of that move around and then obviously affect what the skill position players on those teams are expected to do in 2025. So there's going to be a lot of movement here in the next kind of, let's say, 8 weeks to pull in the draft as well.
Yeah, it's going to be very exciting. You and I are fired up to go through the first little flurry here. Ben and I are going to have a big show in a couple of days looking at the entire free agent picture. Make sure you jump in over for that. Kevin's doing fantastic work on the site, hitting free agent. I've got some more dynasty content. Colm, one of the most fun times of the year. And it's interesting how they kick off here with the QBs, because that does give us a little bit of a framework for evaluating the rest of the picture. If you don't know who's going to be pulling the trigger, it's kind of hard to understand or think through or properly evaluate the ramifications for a lot of teams. As we record today, there's still lots of things up in the air. We're going to get some guys drafted, obviously. I think that 4 rookie QBs are going to factor into teams' plans. The 3rd and 4th may end up in situations that are a little bit more like Michael Penix, but I think if they get shots, they will come through as well. Savvy listeners obviously know some of the guys we're talking about there. We have some great notes on Milroe and Dart in the rookie guide. We'll talk a ton more about them as we go along. But Colm, Geno Smith, really the first big domino to fall.
Yeah, so Geno moves to the Oakland Raiders, and there was some conversation. The other thing I've been surprised about is, sometimes there'll be like a rumor that appears and, I was going to use the word, I'll say simmers. I was going to say festers for a couple of weeks before something actually happens. But these have been like something pops up and then you're like, well, I wonder what'll happen there. And like 6 hours later, it's like players moved, deal's done. So Geno Smith, there was some reports, but he moves to the Oakland Raiders, and which I think is a pretty savvy move for the Raiders, picking him up in this situation, because they have a lot of holes, and I think for the price the thing is going to be they're probably going to extend him to a pretty big contract, which maybe isn't the best move looking forward. But what we want to talk about, Shawn, is the impact for both Geno entering this season and then some of the skill position players that are around that, before we look then at the Seahawks, because I mentioned DK Metcalf as well. There's a lot of parts moving, which makes it all the more intriguing. So when we look at the Raiders, Shawn, top of that chart is going to be Brock Bowers. Now, Geno Smith, some of his metrics towards tight ends hasn't been all that impressive, but if we look at who has been his tight ends in Seattle, it hasn't been, the top tier of tight end that we'd be looking for. And I know offense to somebody we've liked for many years, but let's not kid ourselves that he's on the same tier here as one Brock Bowers. So I guess that is the place to kick it off. And then they have, wide receivers who we've seen over the last season or 2 seasons have some productive fantasy value and even just, some flashes here and there. But it really is about how much of an upgrade can Geno Smith be for this roster, and particularly when we're looking at a first round pick in fantasy terms for Brock Bowers in 2025 over, the kind of carousel that was there last year, which was a bit of a train wreck. So what is your thoughts on this move for Geno and for Bowers? And I guess if you want to sprinkle in for the Raiders.
The Smith move is interesting because from a team building perspective. Obviously, the Seahawks felt like they could let go a guy who has played reasonably well for the last several years. Now, we continue to get dominoes falling in Seattle that suggest that Mike McDonald, the new head coach there, was not happy at all with the 2024 version of the offense. You get an offensive coordinator firing. You supposedly have one of the main questions in interviews with potential offensive coordinators. How are you going to use DK Metcalf? How are you going to unlock all the talent that is there? And yet, when Metcalf doesn't want to be there anymore, they are fine shipping him off. You also move the QB, and the sort of expectation or the understanding that they have is that for the money we were going to have to spend on Geno, we can spend that on someone like Sam Darnold, get the same caliber of performance, and also get this draft pick. There's some value to that, especially if you are moving forward with a new offensive coordinator and you're early in the build with the new head coach that you are hoping will be a decades-long anchor for your entire organization. I think it's a savvy move in some ways when you describe it like that, but there's the potential for this to be a lose-lose, right? Where both organizations end up paying a lot of money to quarterbacks who are viable and will allow you to be competitive in the way that the bottom sort of 10 to 15 guys, players like Will Levis, simply won't allow you to be competitive. But you're spending a ton of money on these guys. And then for them to be viable, you have to surround them with players like Sam Darnold had last year, where you have Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison and TJ Hawkinson, solid veteran running back in Aaron Jones, a great offensive coordinator. If you're the Seahawks, maybe you're saying, well, we're putting together this 49ers light or this sort of old school, stretching all the way back to the Denver Broncos, the Houston Texans, the Kubiak tree, all of that with the original Shanahan. And we're going to have an elite offensive coordinator, and all of these things are going to work. Sam Darnold was apocalyptically bad in their most important games last season. That's with superstars. It's in the dome. You're going to be playing behind a bad offensive line in the rain. Now that you don't have DK Metcalf, it's with a small receiver that we love, but how are you going to add around him? Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that Ben and I did a full show on, and maybe it's my favorite show in a long time, is the need to build these super teams on offense, these incredible juggernauts. If you want to compete with the best teams, it's really hard for me to understand how this move accomplishes that for either team, because you've sunk a lot of money into a QB who ranks in that sort of 15 to 20 range. And then you still got to go out and build the entire rest of it as well. You mentioned Brock Bowers and the Raiders. I do think that the Raiders are getting the better QB in this deal, and a lot of that is going to be situational. One of the things that I always think is interesting is to pull up the SIS numbers, look at the IQR, which is essentially their QB rating that has removed things like drops, dropped interceptions, throwaways, things that wouldn't be on the quarterback. It doesn't tend to change the numbers dramatically, but for a few players here and there, Russell Wilson actually looks better, right? Which is one that I would obviously disagree with a bit, but you do have some movement there. When we look at those numbers for this season, Sam Darnold ranked 11th, Geno Smith ranked 19th. There was a pretty meaningful gap in those two players. And yet, when you look at it, it's basically based on touchdown percentage. And that's pretty easy to explain away based on the dome, the coordinator, and the quality of the receiving options. Now, one of the things that we had with the Seahawks last year is they did have DK Metcalf. They did have JSN. I mean, Metcalf is not remotely in the same range as a Justin Jefferson. And JSN, Jordan Addison, probably somewhat similar players. They're obviously smaller. They're not perfect matches stylistically, but are going to do similar things for you there. When we look at the on target percentage for the 2024 season, Geno Smith ranks second behind only Joe Burrow. When we look at catchable percentage, fourth behind only Burrow, Tua, and Baker Mayfield. Some interesting names at the top there. Tua especially was targeting guys much closer to the line of scrimmage than Geno was. The sack percentages for Geno and for Sam Darnold were the same. But if you've watched these two teams play, and if you think about those few moments that Geno Smith was not under center, I mean, Geno is dealing with the type of pass rush and is getting the ball out in a way that few other QBs are doing. He does it with great arm talent, and he does it with great accuracy. Those things being arguably slightly different elements there. Sam Darnold, well down in terms of catchable percentage, well down in terms of on-target percentage. Certainly not bad in those areas, but especially when you consider the context that he's working with. I mean, these are two very different players. I would expect Geno to play much better in 2025 than Sam Darnold does. The other thing that we see with Smith, in part, I think because he has to get rid of the ball so quickly, but also I think the facet of how he plays, he's really good at getting the ball to his initial target. And so when you think about the way their offense played in 2023, that meant the pre-snap read and then getting the ball out. He's able to get DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett both over 200 points. We think about where Lockett was and the fall off that he had in 2024. I mean, those are numbers I think you have to put on Smith, at least to an extent, for that 2023 season. You look at this most recent campaign and you have a 250-point year for JSN. That's a fantastic year. I don't think that the wide receiver tight end stuff matters at all, right? For Bowers, he's so completely different than all but two or three other tight ends in the NFL. And because of that, you're going to be running your offensive scheme in a completely different way than almost all other teams do. Because of that, the thing that I want to see is, what are the Raiders going to come out and do? Are they going to add another offensive piece so that Jacoby Myers is not the only guy pulling a little coverage away? If Bowers is the centerpiece of the offense, Geno is a fantastic QB for getting him the ball. I think that this dramatically raises Bowers' floor. It probably doesn't give him the same type of ceiling as if the Raiders had made some type of move to select one of the top couple of QB prospects, swing for the fences there, restart their organization, and have maybe 10, 15 years of glory behind someone who breaks out in a CJ Stroud type of way, or even a Michael Penix type of way. And you have some other types of profiles that would have been in there as well, right? But you think about what they might have been able to do, even something like taking Dart, who, even though, again, stylistically and how their strengths manifest are completely different than Bo Nix, but both guys who are being hammered for things that probably are completely irrelevant to how they transition to the NFL. If Dart ended up being the guy like Nix was for the Broncos, then you're off to the races. With Smith, I mean, you're probably maxed out at being a good team. With the Broncos ascending, with the Chargers looking like they will be a long-term powerhouse, I don't know how a Geno Smith-led team where you're trading for him and then you're going to give him a huge contract and you need to build everything else from the ground up. I mean, how are you going to be competitive in that AFC West?
All very good questions. What I would think is this move takes them from a team that is a 4-win team, which is obviously not very good, to maybe 6 or 7. I don't think this is anything that's going to help them at any point, challenge for the division. But when I look at, the potential upgrade in the quarterback play from last year to this year to Bowers, and to whatever other pieces, Jacoby Myers, whatever else ends up coming in through the draft, I would expect them to look at the running back position through the draft as well to improve there, because the cast of characters isn't going to help them either. And maybe the team does turn around. But Shawn, what I think more teams should do, we did see it with Penix last year, you get Kirk Cousins on a big deal, you take a rookie as well. I think more teams should be like continuing to try and use quarterback picks every year to try and get the position rather than to be like, well, we took a rookie last year and or we're paying Geno Smith, who's 34 years old. Let's go and try and put some competition in there at the same time and get a rookie quarterback on a rookie contract. Maybe we see a situation where the back end of the first round or something, they try and trade back in to get something like that as they move forward here. But not a lot of depth on the Raiders overall. But I think it's going to be a positive for Bowers here as we move into this season. We touched on the Seahawks, and you kind of touched on Sam Darnold and the fit there. As we record this, not signed, does sound like other teams are going to be in the mix, but all points are signing into Sam Darnold signing with the Seahawks. The other Seahawks quarterback, Shawn, that's on board on the roster when we're talking about rookie quarterbacks. One of our rookie favorites a couple of seasons back was Sam Howell. He is there in the roster. Maybe if they do sign Darnold, that means that Howell has a chance to play games in 2025. The Seahawks, though, we have our two running backs there, and Walker and Charbonnet, but JSN, and I kind of joked as you were talking about it, but wide receiver outside of JSN is now non-existent with the move of DK Metcalf. It's Jake Bobo, it's Derek Young. There's nothing there, and then Noah Fant. So they're going to have to do a lot of work here to if they're expecting this team to be competitive in 2025, which I think they were a 10-win team, which I feel like now is probably in the 6 to 7 win category moving forward. But if they're behind in a lot of games, hopefully that means a lot of targets for JSN moving forward. But as listeners will know, Sam Darnold, not one of our preferred quarterback options in 2024. Could be the same here as we move forward. I mentioned the deal that sees Chris Godwin going back to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I thought that he would move elsewhere, but he gets $66 million over 3 years, $44 million guaranteed at signing. Massive contract for a player who obviously missed most of last season, and he's coming off a serious knee injury, so it's really positive to see him get paid like this. Shawn, my question here is that the Buccaneers have stayed fairly intact with all their pieces from 2024, similar offense. We know what they did last year. Chris Godwin, though, coming back, we talked about a potential trade that we're thinking about working back and forth on for Jalen McMillan a couple of weeks ago on the podcast. Chris Godwin being back, though, is he the potentially most impacted guy here on this roster, or how do you think it affects or doesn't affect, maybe it doesn't affect anything here moving forward?
The interesting part of the almost 7,000 word piece I wrote on JSN last summer was that it is very hard to support the three receivers. And you do need to have happen what we discussed for JSN and what he did do, which is to move up the ladder and become the wide receiver one.
And almost for the wide receiver, like in that situation, the wide receiver tree basically fell off a cliff.
When you look at the Bucs, they don't seem to think that Mike Evans or Chris Godwin are anywhere close to that cliff. And while I think you could make a compelling argument that DK Metcalf is a more difficult physical mismatch than Evans or Godwin and does some things that they don't, I also think you could make the it's not even like an opposite argument, but just an equally true type of argument that he's not as strong an overall receiver, that the skills aren't there, or they don't manifest in a way that the team can consistently take advantage of in the way that you can take advantage of Mike Evans, that you can take advantage of Chris Godwin. And then Jalen McMillan becomes this really nice complementary piece. And you're starting to think of some of these teams, like a Peyton Manning type of team, some of those Aaron Rodgers teams, where the second or third pieces would go and score 12, 13, 14 touchdowns. When you look at McMillan, what he did in college when he's in this three wide receiver group, what he did last season as a touchdown scorer down the stretch, I still think that he can be very dynamic. I still think that he's a good dynasty piece. We do run into situations like this all the time where either the older player in Evans really does hit the wall, or the slightly younger but more injury-plagued guy in Chris Godwin, who's dealt with all kinds of difficult injuries over the last 4 or 5 years, that he isn't the guy. you really only need one of the two of them falling off. It's certainly not impossible that they both would. It never feels like that's going to happen until it does, even when the players get very old, like a Travis Kelce. When I was on the FFPC pod the other day talking with Eric, we were looking into Travis Kelce, and I was going through the numbers and saying it's not that he's fallen off a little bit. You look at the peripherals, and Kelce is, the Chiefs probably would have preferred he retire, right? That's the level that he was playing at last year. You don't know when we're going to hit that for Evans, for Godwin. I would try to pick up McMillan anytime that you can now. The kind of issue that we're running into in our OT league is that our listeners, our league mates who have him are very savvy managers. They put together a team that is building for the future that has a ton of picks. They're going to have a ton of picks this year. They're going to have, once they're done with the churn, they'll probably have a ton of picks in 2026. The value that they have attached to McMillan, which I think is very fair, is one that because it's fair, you probably don't need to make the move. You're more looking to buy McMillan now in situations where you can do a true buy low. So we're probably not going to make that trade, which is always disappointing because we like to make as many trades as we can in this league for fun as much as for anything else. One of the things that we were sort of looking for as we continue to try and evaluate this trade was, what's the situation going to be with Chris Godwin? The Bucs had been pretty insistent they were going to get him back. I didn't necessarily think that made sense for either the team or the player, but you love to see this, right? And we talk about, again, building those juggernaut offenses. You need all of that firepower around Baker Mayfield, and Baker Mayfield was fantastic last year. We now have multiple good seasons from him. We have multiple seasons where the offense has been interesting. You think about the coordinators both getting head coaching jobs as a result of what they were able to do with Baker Mayfield. That part is somewhat amusing. I'm sure that Mayfield himself was like, I'm good. I was superstar in college, top draft pick. If the Browns weren't going to respect the fact that I played hurt for them and that changed, what the outcomes were, and they want to go get Deshaun Watson instead, more power to them. This is more about me than about the coordinators. We'll see how that goes. But certainly the big difference between 2023 and 2024 in Tampa was Bucky Irving. Once you actually have that running back to round it out, now this offense is incredibly explosive. I'm excited to see what they're able to do as they take the next step. They've done a lot of things right. They still don't seem exactly like a power team, but they were one of my favorite sleeper teams last year. It would have been fun if they could have gotten a little deeper in the playoffs.
The next team to talk about is the Steelers. They acquired DK Metcalf. Shawn, this was an interesting one. Felt a bit like, we've seen a few deals done in recent times, touching on the Browns. Myles Garrett signed a massive contract this week, wanted out. There's talk of like all these demands that a player has. It was similar with DK Metcalf. It's like, want a contender, warm weather, want these things. And it's like, yeah, I'll sign for the Seahawks. Just give me the money. It's like, we get it. At the end of the day, most of the time it comes down to the figures on the contract. But Metcalf for a second round pick in 2025. It also, the reports being that the Seahawks wanted a bit more than this, and they come down to this range. But the Steelers now have paired him with George Pickens. Mike Williams was there last year. The thing with, I could see this going off the rails pretty quick, Shawn. We were talking about like the moving pieces and stable quarterback environments. That was another thing DK Metcalf wanted. Pittsburgh Steelers, not a stable quarterback environment. George Pickens, sometimes not very stable with things on the field either. So what is your thoughts here on the DK Metcalf trade? I think this is like an arrow down for Metcalf, for Pickens, and we'll see who ends up being the quarterback. Maybe whoever comes in as the Steelers quarterback, it could potentially be an arrow up for them, but there's a lot of questions that need to be answered before that happens. But I'm not overly enthused by this move.
Well, these seem like baseball team trades, right? Where things fitting together, personalities, accountability, and say, doesn't really matter. Now, obviously, some of those things matter in baseball as well. But you now have two mercurial, inconsistent, I don't know if selfish can be attached to Metcalf, although his trade demands, sort of veer in that direction.
But he also must be willing to meet in the middle because the demands are not what he settled for here.
Well, he's like, all these people bashing me. I don't know if they understand negotiating. It's like you put out a position here, the opponent puts out a position here, you guys meet in the middle. It's like I was just trying to get a good middle ground there. So maybe that's the case. We do know that in order to unlock these guys, Colm, the rumors right now, Monday morning,
are not unlocking them.
Well, I mean, we're going to definitely add a big selfish piece to the mix. We go from holy water to...
To be honest, the Steelers have so far out of the teams we've talked about outside of the Bucs, the best team in terms of like they have a strong defense. They have some pieces on offense. They also tagged or they tendered Jalen Warren to keep him on the roster, but it feels like they are the team at the minute that is going to be like when the music stops in this QB carousel dance, a game of musical chairs. Whoever is not wanted everywhere else is probably the quarterback that's going to end up on the Steelers. And it seems like at the minute that's probably going to be Aaron Rodgers. So I think that's who you're hinting at with the other piece that's coming in. But it's very hard to see this all meshing together on offense.
So Rodgers looked completely done last season. He played one of the worst games that I can remember. So Colin, when we look at Aaron Rodgers, he does turn in middle of the pack-ish numbers in IQR and points above average per attempt. That's even when you include that week 17 apocalypse against the Buffalo Bills. We know he was able to find his guy in Davante Adams. We know he was not able to find Garrett Wilson, and that he was frustrated with the execution, again, of numerous teammates. The question that I think you run into when you have a DK Metcalf, when you have a George Pickens, and you think about their strengths and weaknesses, is that these guys are playmakers who are going to want you to throw the ball up to them and let them make plays. And discipline is not necessarily the key element there. Sort of the opposite direction of what Aaron Rodgers is always begging for. And then you get a version of him that is so reduced that even if you do those things, mostly he's not going to play particularly well. You contrast that with someone like Justin Fields, who wasn't allowed to really throw the ball last year, still was a very good quarterback for fantasy. Colin, we traded for him on our team that we took over as an orphan. I'm still very happy with that trade. I think that Justin Fields is going to be a good piece as we go forward. It's going to be in that 8 to 12 range in Superflex at the QB position for a long time. A lot of knocks on Fields as a passer, but in 2023, he unlocked DJ Moore, Cole Kmet, two guys who have really struggled in a lot of other situations, including this last year, obviously, with Caleb Williams. What would be your preference if you now are a Steelers fan and you're looking at Aaron Rodgers or you're looking at Justin Fields? Two quarterbacks with very different strengths, very different weaknesses, and different points along their journey. You now have what should be a very fun offense, right? I mean, Jalen Warren, I'm extremely fired up about. He's someone I think is one of the few really good running back values out there that's not a rookie, right? So even though you can assume that someone else is going to be dropped in there to be a committee mate, I think he's off to the races and should be set up well regardless of who the QB is. You've got wide receivers teams are going to have to pay at least some attention to. But looking at this QB situation, Fields, it appears he's being connected to the Jets, the Colts, and the Steelers. Who do you prefer in Pittsburgh? And then where's Justin Fields going to go?
Well, I was kind of excited when we had the situation last year with Fields in Pittsburgh. I think part of the reason, if I'm reading between the tea leaves with Fields, that he hasn't already, agreed something with the Steelers is that they didn't treat him there wasn't a lot of fair treatment in the way it was handled last season. So I fully understand if he's looking to move in a different direction. I wouldn't be against seeing him with either the Jets or the Steelers here as we move forward. I think the Colts, there's still going to be a lean to Anthony Richardson, so there's going to be an uphill battle there. I think he wants to go somewhere where he thinks that he can be the starter. The other like quarterbacks that are involved in terms of who could be the Steelers quarterback, we mentioned Aaron Rodgers. You have Daniel Jones. The reports are that he's going to sign with the Vikings moving forward here. I just think it's very hard to be excited about a lot of the options that could land here. I think the most exciting option would be Fields. I don't think Fields is going to end up with the Steelers. So let me put him on the Jets and see what happens going forward with him and Breece Hall in that backfield to try and get some read option plays and things like that moving forward. But yeah, that is concerning. The last thing, Shawn, to finish up on here on the show is the Rams signed Davante Adams to a 2-year contract, $26 million guaranteed at signing $46 million over those 2 years. Wouldn't really enjoy being, Cooper Kupp here in this news coming in. The Rams kind of said, we don't want an old wide receiver, so we're going to move on from you. And then they give this contract to Davante Adams. They did keep Matthew Stafford a couple of weeks ago, so it does feel like they're trying to see what they can do here for maybe one run with Stafford, but looks now like more and more like Kupp will be on the outs with the Rams. I find this, and I'm a big Davante Adams fan from his time in Green Bay, obviously. Last year didn't go all that great for him. Still had over 1,000 yards receiving on the season in total, but I found this kind of with the Cooper Kupp news tied into it as well. Pretty startling for the contract that they handed out here. What is your thoughts? We didn't get a chance to talk with the Stafford part of it, but the Stafford re-signing I thought was a big uptick here for Puka Nacua. What are you factoring the Davante Adams part in here? I don't think this was a good move in terms of fantasy for the Rams. The Rams don't care about fantasy though.
The Rams, you gotta love the Rams and how aggressive
they are. Aggressive, always. Yeah.
You also have to love the fact that when they had some draft picks last year, they hit. Now, some of that is going to be merely luck, but they certainly are doing a lot of things right. I mean, Cooper Kupp does get paid by them. And so from that perspective, I don't think that you can say that they, have created this horrible situation or that they overused him in their previous pushes and now, they're not going to stand by. He's somebody I think is still pretty interesting. It would be fascinating to work through sort of the internal evaluations here, how these games plans worked. I mean, one of the things was that at midseason, Cooper Kupp still looked very, very good. And then you take this detour in the final third where it's exclusively Puka, Cooper Kupp not drawing any targets, doesn't seem to be able to challenge defenses or make defenses account for him in any way. And I mean, almost in a situation like DeAndre Hopkins with the Chiefs, some of these guys who have been completely and totally done. Every time that the Rams seem like they're ready to build for the long term and build a powerhouse that maybe can't be dealt with on the NFC side, they do short-term things that then have these likely ramifications where they get caught on these seasons, like the ones outside of their Super Bowl seasons, right? Where they don't have the depth, they don't have the youth, they don't have even the star pieces. And you can look at some of the things they've done at quarterback. Matthew Stafford won a Super Bowl for them. They are in a situation where he's probably a bigger arm talent than Jared Goff. But you think about how much that trade cost them and how good Goff has looked with the Detroit Lions. And you then run into a situation where it's like, either A, you weren't as good of a coach. And I don't think Sean McVay wants to admit that. Or B, you weren't as good from a team building perspective. You didn't put the guys around Goff. I don't know that they necessarily want to admit that, but certainly when you're doing the types of things that they're doing, it's going to be hard to have an Amon-Ra, a Jameson Williams, a Jahmyr Gibbs, a Sam Laporta, an elite offensive line, all of those different types of things simultaneously. This deal where you're moving on from Kupp and bringing in Davante Adams, somebody who had a really poor on-target catch percentage last season. And even if some of the dynamism is still there, you're not getting peak Davante Adams by any stretch. You couldn't have used that money in either multiple small ways or one big way that was much, much better. I mean, this is basically the wide receiver version of that QB trade, probably, right? We'll see what happens here. This is another one where it's kind of hard to like the way that Davante Adams has handled things in his whole saga that has been tied to Aaron Rodgers.
Yeah, so we will see what happens moving forward. There's a lot more pieces to fall, as we mentioned there, particularly with the Steelers quarterback and around the league. There's a number of other situations like that need to be cleared up. As Shawn mentioned, him and Ben will have a show looking through some of this stuff later this week for Stadium Bananas. We are going to close it off there. We didn't mention it at the top of the show, but you can still purchase the RotoViz Rookie Guide, $30 for all 3 versions, available on rotoviz.com. Part 2 is the post-combine. Part 3 will come out post-NFL draft. You get all 3 of those, as I mentioned, for $30. And there is, in that guide, a $30 coupon for a RotoViz subscription, or a $30 discount off a RotoViz subscription, so you can use that as well. But that's where we're going to close it off. We will be back later in the week with another edition focusing on some dynasty topics. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on social media at Overtime Ireland. You can check out all of Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.